Hello, everybody. This is dogmancams.com, and I'm your host, John Bell. And today we've got a special guest with us, Ed Roman. Ed Roman's from Canada. Ed, why don't you give us a brief bio on yourself?
Good to be here, John, and good talking to you. A brief bio. Let's see. I'm a Canadian singer-songwriter, born, bred, raised, or hatched, however you want to look at it, in the province of Ontario, Canada. I've been working all over the world for the last 7 years, working with Michael Stover down in Pittsburgh. He's my manager and publicist. I write the music I write is a kitchen sink. It's a little bit of everything from rock and roll, funk, R&B, spoken word, country. I like a lot of different kind of stuff, so that's where my music is always going. And it's good to be here on the show today.
Yeah, that's great. And we were talking before. I like the diversity. Industry always wants to pigeonhole you. I know you when I worked in Los Angeles in Hollywood. Same thing. They want to pigeonhole you, and they always warn you: be careful where you break out in the industry because you tend to really get stuck there, and they don't want you to move around. Same thing with Publishers. If you write a book, they only want a book on the same kind of genre. They don't want you to go into, oh, I've got more, aspirations than just writing this with this one type of genre kind of thing. But yeah, why don't you tell us about the encounter you had?
Well, yeah, I guess, as I was saying, we were talking before offline or off air that I'm still trying to define it completely. I remember it so vividly because, to tell you the truth, it terrified me. I had
Right.
never been more afraid, other than, a black bear outside my tent at 2 a.m. with my dog going crazy, thinking, I could be a part of the food chain here any minute.
Right.
But having this peace of mind to get up with a canoe whistle and an old bayonet of my grandfather's in a frying pan to scare her away.
Right.
This was very different, because what had happened that day, I grow a lot of food. I have a very large garden, a large pasture in behind my place, about 50 acres, that sort of breeds onto a deciduous and coniferous forest. Lots of pines, maples, all kinds of different stuff in there. Small creek, little corduroy road. And my dog, just where we are, we've got deer, porcupine, anything you can kind of think of that's in this sort of natural living forest coming in and out of the pasture on a regular basis. He'd been chased up to the house a couple of times by two coyotes, almost like to the door. And it was the middle of July. It was like the 7th of July. I was going to the garden. It was 6:30 in the middle of the day, late evening, or early evening, excuse me. It was hot. It had to have been 30-degree weather. So here, due to transfer, it's about 90 degrees, 89 degrees Fahrenheit. And I heard coyotes. They were going ballistic, and there was a lot of them. There was, I couldn't tell you how many, because basically they were hiding in the forest. But I had the peace of mind to put the dog back in the house just in case there was some kind of altercation between the coyotes and the dog. So as I walk back, my field line sort of comes up on a rise and then slopes down towards the forest. And as I'm coming up, my visual spectrum starts to pick up what I see. And the first thing that comes into my mind is this: why is there a really tall man wearing a skidoo suit, black skidoo suit, and a balaclava in 90-degree weather in the middle of July, and the coyotes are not there? There's a lot of them, but they're in the forest line. I can't see them, but they're yipping. They're like going like crazy. And all of a sudden, I'm kind of like, as I'm walking up, I'm questioning this. This thing squats down like it's like on its haunches. And there's a whole bunch of brambly kind of stuff at the base of the hill, where the pasture ends, from big thistles to dogwood and all kinds of stuff, blackberries. It then, like within just a couple of seconds, bolts out, like on four legs, like running from like bipedally from the front to back, and moving at such an alarming speed and astonishing movement that it covers like 50 yards within like 5 bounds. And I'm watching it at this point, trying to go what am I looking at? Because it almost seemed to change its perception from it being very svelte, looking at the forest. So I'm looking at it from on its side perspective, to after it squats down to bolting out into the pasture where it's actually looking at me face and chest forward. And it was so broad, the shoulders itself, it looked like, you know, it was shoulder pad worthy, like it was, but extremely tight in the waist and very haunchy in the back, all very dark hair. I also remember, like, you know, things when there's stuff is happening from a car accident to other things that are like you're trying to process the information as it's happening. All I could think about was these like Jeannie Goodall documentaries I've seen of her working with mountain gorillas where they get really aggravated and come out of the bush, and you can sort of see that undulating muscular structure in their chest. So that it actually has this wiggle movement as it's moving and moving forward like almost like a jackrabbit. And then I'm in this sort of crouched at this moment, genuflecting kind of position, trying to decide whether or not I should run or I should stay to watch what's going on. And and all of a sudden it just stopped. And it stood up on two legs again, facing me. And it's like I'm assuming it's looking at me because it's standing upright and I'm watching it. It turns to its left and it walks on two legs, half of that 50-acre pasture, all the way down into the back part of the bush again. And I lost sight of it. And I was alarmed. I was terrified. I came back into the house. I called my mom and my brother, a couple other family members. I told my wife what had happened. She thought I was crazy. I couldn't go back to the bush for over a half a year by myself because of how afraid I was. I had never been that afraid because, again, it's like one of the times that I've been really close to being, you know, hurt in a car accident, all that slow motionness, even though it's happening within seconds, the entire experience must have only took when I saw it to when it stood up and went through the, like, bolted through the field towards me, stood up again, and then started walking. Couldn't have only been about 45 to 50 seconds. But, and so many people are always like, well, why didn't you have your camera? Why didn't you go get your phone? It's like, in those moments, time is almost standing still because you're having processing issues. So you're trying to like go, what am I looking at? Is this what I'm seeing? Do I run? Am I going to be hurt? Now what is happening? Who do I tell? All of that starts running through your mind. The last thing you think about usually, unless it's you've got your phone out and you're just so happen to be doing stuff with it, that's the last thing you're going to be thinking about doing. Hey, if you're in a car accident spinning around at 80 miles an hour on a snowy road, you pull your phone out and go, hey, check this out. I'm going to film it. No, usually you don't. You're trying to control everything about what's going on, including your own safety inside of the situation. So I thought, okay, I took a little video of it. I talked about the story. I tried to show some things that were comparison related, like the tree that it was standing next to an area that I thought looked like it had been bedded down by something. I crawled around looking for hair, scat. I contacted John Bindernagel, who's a very well-respected wildlife biologist at the University in the United States. I had also tried connecting with Jeff Meldrum, who I believe is at the University of Ohio. And he's another expert on the grassman and a lot of, the footprints that have basically come in to analyze, things that people have sent to him. Yes, it has dermal ridging. It has all these different kinds of things that are indicative of not being a fake. They turned me on to the BFRO, which is the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, because they felt this is what I had an experience with. The two people came up here sort of with different opinions about how to approach the situation. One was more taking an aggressive stance, like we have to protect ourselves with a weapon, and he brought a gun with him. And then the other person was more like, no, we want to gift things and leave apples and see if they respond and those kinds of things. They took my report. They were here for a couple hours. I took them back into the bush where it all had happened. And I kind of never heard from anybody again. But it's funny. There's a couple people from the Aboriginal community that I've really taken to heart when it comes to what that experience represented for me. Without sounding weirdly, egotistical about it, they basically said the reason that sometimes this happens is for a reason. You can't go looking for something like this. The reason that something like this occurs is because you were meant to see it for some reason. And it's funny, other people, like I was mentioning, M.K. Davis, who's a very well-known, reputable researcher doing this kind of stuff in the United States, had said something similar, but he had learned those exact same things from the Yakima and other people that had told him that, the reason that certain people see them are for certain reasons, whether they can articulate the experience. It's something prolific for them personally. From what I've come to understand in my own experience, there are a lot of people that may have had experiences, but they don't want to talk about it. They don't even want to bring it up. They're so fearful of not just the ridicule, but just what the entire moment represents. As I said, there's something akin to something like a fight or flight mechanism that's turning on that would be there on an adrenal level if you were in an accident or something serious was going on with you. To me, it was a life-changing experience, and it's not like before I wasn't interested in things that were paranormally related. Some could chalk that up from a psychological perspective as to however they want to cut and dry it. But for me, my experience has made me look at the world a little differently, in a way that's not so clinical, and I feel more attuned to my living environment because of that experience. I'm so much more hyper aware of things that are occurring to me, and I can even, without sounding too elaborate about it, I was working in the garden one day and I watched an entire hive of bees follow a queen out of the field and went into a tree to make a new hive, being made aware by this vibrating sound coming out of the field and it passing over my head and having to duck from this cloud of bees. Had almost the same experience as the black bear, but it is akin to that same mystical experience that I was lucky enough to be aware of. It somehow made me like, it's not even like the working on a farm with a lot of dangerous equipment aware, or on a drilling rig, with a lot of danger. It's a different kind of an awareness, maybe to subtle energy or subtle systems that leave me in a state of awe. I'm humbled by those moments in a way that I nothing else in this world has yet done.
Right. That's amazing. And one of the viewers asked, "Did you hear any sounds when you saw this creature?"
No, it was the coyotes, the yipping. When it crouched down, that's when the coyotes almost seemed to stop, because I think now, looking back in retrospect, perhaps they were anticipating something that he was going to do, either attack or whatever it may have been. All I remember is that on about the third or fourth bound, I could feel like, if you ever hear a cow running out of pasture, you can get a little bit of that stompy feel. Yeah, I couldn't feel it because I wasn't close enough to it, but I could definitely hear it in the air from it touching the ground, especially when its back feet touched the ground.
Right.
But there was nothing. It was so silent, even when it turned and walked. No, nothing. It was like weird.
But you said the coyotes went quiet.
Totally quiet. Totally quiet, and made no other sound after it did that and walked away from where it went from that standing position to after it walked out of the field again. And I never heard the coyotes after that again.
And when it started to move and bound, what direction was it heading in at that time?
West. It was coming from the east directly west. West, southwest. But yeah, definitely west, up a hill. So the incline of the field's at about 20 degrees. It's great for growing millet at the back, and more terracey for like wheat and corn and other stuff on the main part of the field.
Right.
It was headed west, and predominantly westerly winds here. That's why I was saying I was probably upwind of it, and whatever I was giving off within seconds, just because we have on average here, 10 to 20 mile an hour winds where I live, up in the second highest elevation in Ontario. We have wind farms and things like that up here. So it probably gave wind of myself fairly quickly.
Right. And you mentioned a tree that you were able to see near it. Were you able to get a size estimation based on the tree?
Yeah, the cedar was about 6 feet tall. I'm about 5'11" and a half, so it was just above my head. And I'd
Mm.
say it was at least another foot past that. I'm thinking it was pushing 7 feet because I remember thinking it was a big. Why is there a big man, like a man, big man?
Right.
And now in retrospect, that point, this thing that I thought was a balaclava, that's part of the height of whatever this was.
Right.
So that point is pushing into that 7 foot range. So 6 foot something at the shoulders, maybe another foot and a half or something at the. It's hard at 50 acres trying to judge height and distance. But that little tree was about 6 feet tall. That little cedar.
And you just said 50 acres. That was the view and distance you estimated the creature was?
Yeah, I was about at the top end of the pasture, and there's between me and the bottom end of the pasture is about 50 acres.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you said in the pre-interview you went back to look for a sign later, although you didn't do it right away because of, fearful to go in there. What did you find when you went looking for that?
Well, immediately I started looking for prints. I mean, it happened in July, and I didn't go back until September.
Right.
I'm I'm ashamed to say I was afraid.
Oh, sure. I absolutely would have been as well.
I've been in circumstances with others. When I was a kid, I was almost kidnapped when I was 12, coming home from hockey practice. I won't lie to you. I was terrified. And for 2 years, after the
Right.
detectives took the report and the police came to my house, I was watching over my shoulder for 2 years.
Right.
And I'm not abashed to say that. I'm not going to be stupid enough to. So the same thing with that. I just didn't want to put myself in harm's way. Also, I was afraid of talking about it and mentioning it in ways because I already have an affiliation with the supernatural, some things that have happened in my life, my own family's experiences with a mass UFO sighting that was documented by local newspapers and the Buttonville Airport. That already I was there. Oh, sure, Ed, one of your stories, da 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 da. What did you see now? What I immediately started to look for was something that I could lay as evidence to somebody. Like, look, here's a footprint. See, look, I took a video of it. I took a picture of it. I did find this bedded down area, and I know as well as everybody else, maybe probably listen to the show, deer, moose, elk, everything you can think of, water buffalo. They all will bed down grassy areas. Do whatever they're doing to lie down, comfort for the night, security, whatever it may be. But there was something there, and months later. So whether or not it was left by that or not, I don't know. It was
Sure.
my fear that promoted the idea of I'm not going back there for a while. I'm really nervous. Even when I was working in the garden, I'd be like, every 10 minutes looking over just checking the pasture, making sure there's nothing strange standing out there. Like, for almost a year. It took me that sense of like, okay, I'm going to be comfortable to do this
Right.
again. And I think that whether they're habitual or not, they're in a certain area for certain reasons, for certain periods of times, or they're migratory. I mean, a lot of researchers that I talk to, like John Bindernagel, he says, whether they're using the corridors like the Adirondacks, the Alleghenies. You're talking about animals that could be moving, species that are moving from as far north as Quebec all the way down in Louisiana.
Oh, yeah.
So if I wanted to be somebody that was unseen, I wouldn't be using highways and roadways, and I'd be using cemeteries, mountains, ditches, forests, anything that you could possibly think of to make sure I was unseen.
Right.
And I think that would behoove any migratory animal, considering who we are as people.
So, what was your impression of what you saw? Did you think it was what did you think it was?
Well, I mean, I thought it was a man, a hairy man. And so immediately I'm thinking it's like Sasquatch, Bigfoot. I grew up with those legends in and around Canada. I mean, from, when I was a young man to where I am today. So that was my first impression. But I know even my mother-in-law many years ago, just towards Lake Huron, about an hour and a half north of here, northwest, town of Port Elgin, Katy, Southampton. When she was much younger, 16 or 17, was coming home through the town of Katy area off side road. I can't remember whatever it was. She told the story about seeing this wolf man running bipedally So just two legs running across the road in front of their car. The lights caught sight of it. What she remembers the most is this hairy dog-like looking face, and this snout almost like, and that's what she remembers. And she wouldn't want to talk about it. That's the other thing. Again, like I was mentioning before, there's a lot of people that their fear of it is this, what they just don't want to talk about, or the ridicule of what it is. I know good friends of mine that refuse to talk about anything paranormal because it just makes them tip out the door. It terrifies them. So I can understand why, people would be resistant of discussing that. But again, my area, from what I can understand, since the 20s, has had so many different kinds of cryptid experiences, people that have had, and it could be anything from a visual sighting of something that's, like similar to what I've had, or like my mother-in-law had, or sounds. Literally, one of the reports that I read about in this orchard that's just about an hour north of where I was, near the forest, they had reported hearing like monkey sounds coming out of the forest, like in the 30s. And then you start looking at it and putting the bulk of that information together. Well, there must be something to it in terms of people's perceptions as to what's going on. It's important that they document it and that we have it there for posterity's sake.
Right.
But yeah.
So after time's gone by and you've had more time to process this, now what do you think it was that you saw?
Well, I mean, I feel like was more gorilla or human like than it was like dogman like.
Right.
But again,
and what gives you, how do you come to that conclusion?
The face, the flatness of the face, and that when it was running at me, this sense of like this patchiness around the eyes and the mouth. It almost looked like dark skin instead of hair there. So my original thought was, that's what led me to the Jeannie Goodall thought about when it was running, to seeing its face. It had a very dark skin to it, almost like a gorilla would have, that isn't covered with that part of the fur of the face.
And how do you describe the legs, the knees?
This was really weird. It wasn't like staunch, choppy, like big, bolstery like a gorilla. The knees were definitely bending forward like a man.
Like a human.
Like a human. The calves of it were huge, like immense calves. Very, like what I could see of the feet, because it was all moving very quickly at the time. It almost seemed like uniformed in the weirdest of ways from the calf back into the foot. Like the foot was very hairy, in the front half of the foot especially. It's funny, the haunches of the animal weren't. They seemed to be much thinner and going into the waist. The waist was extremely svelte, like a 24-inch waist, 22-inch waist, giving way to this really wide, robust chest and shoulder system, and extremely large arms, long arms. The arms were what's the weird part about it is that they almost seem to be like similar to the legs in the weirdest of ways, especially when it stood up. It was like, am I looking at something that has back legs on its shoulders? Like, and maybe that's like, and how if you see a gorilla and it's like looking at you like with that profile, like a bulldog with that, and its shoulders are puffed forward. That's another reason why it's like, shoulder pads. It led me to that thinking behind it. But that's what it was. Very well built. It was like a muscle man with a really tight waist.
And in the pre-interview, you spoke about it's running in a particular fashion, almost jackrabbit right. Like, can you describe that for the listeners?
Yeah, after it had come out and stood like squatted down, it went from that squatting position to bolting like that, like a quadruped. And I remember it was like, so the front legs are moving forward. It's pulling it's like it was pulling itself across the ground, and almost so fast that the underlegs would shoot forward. And then, and like, if you were seeing somebody with a wheelchair or something that's doing that. And when each stop would happen, like, or each bound would happen, you could see that the muscle structure in the chest, which was extremely formidable, would like shake from each bound that it would take. So it's like ba-boom, shake, ba-boom, shake, ba-boom, shake, ba-boom, until it finally takes this, like, it stops and just it stood up so calmly. It went from being in such an aggressive state to first standing there, not being aggressive, staring at the forest of coyotes going crazy, to squatting down, to being like, I'm in attack mode, running at you towards where you are, to stopping and just like going completely flat, turning and walking away like, I want nothing to do with you.
And you said it seemed like it almost hopped.
Yeah, like the jackrabbit thing. Like, have you ever seen, like, I got rabbits around my place, and when they take off, the dog would chase them. They got that. So that's what I felt like I was looking at. Like, it had that kind of, like, the back legs are coming forward to the front of the chest area to help propel it even further, to kick off again so that the front legs can grab at the ground again and push itself forward again. And each one of those jaunts was like, yards. Right. It wasn't just like a small little couple of feet that it was taking. It was like bounding in an alarming rate, or an alarming space. Those 5 or 6 spaces that it took, 4 or 5 spaces that it took, and that's why I was like, I'm terrified. This thing is moving so fast and moving at these astonishing spaces. Well, how much time do I really have here? That's the only way that I could define it. Like, and I'm using the jackrabbit analogy too, because when I was reading some of the other reports of other people that had reported other things in the area for years, this is something that struck me. That this similar occurrence with 4 other people in a vehicle coming up to an open field line that they thought a deer was coming out of, slowed the vehicle down to avoid the collision, and in the process realizing it looks like a large, hairy jackrabbit man running, towards the road line. There's something very similar about that movement of it, And I'm not a primate expert by any means, and I've only seen some gorilla stuff, like everybody else has. But I just know it wasn't natural. I've never seen a human be able to do that,
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, and did you see a tail of any kind or no?
No tail. There was no tail at all that I can remember. I remember the head being very pointy.
Okay. Well, one thing that this certainly brings to mind is, it's oftentimes I've found people are mistaken between the Sasquatch and the Dogman. There's different types of Dogmen, and Jeff Natalone on his show, Dogman Encounters, he has a supposed reported whistleblower named Victor that claims that there's 2 types of dogmen that from a government military aspect. And he says that there's one type that looks more like kind of a werewolf, which is just which looks more like a human, but covered in all fur, not having a snout, not having a tail, but looks more like and having normal legs and knees, kind of like a human being. So it looks more like a Bigfoot, but with more of a canine featured face, but without a snout. And then he says there's another type that they refer to as the Dogman that is just like a large canine or wolf that can be bipedal and looks exactly like that, Huh. So what intrigues me is the description. At first I would think, like you said, it sounds like a Bigfoot, but when you give the description about how this thing moves and bounds and the length of its arms and the way that the arms and the legs are moving together, and it sounds to me more like it sounds like the Jeff Natalone's description or Victor's description of the werewolf type, if that's actually a thing. Although I will say I have another friend of mine who has encountered both types, and he had nothing to do that was anything related with Jeff Natalone's show or Victor, his source. But yet he gives his own encounter, how he came across 2 different kinds. And when he gives the description of the 2 different kinds, it follows exactly what Jeff Natalone and his source Victor claims. Huh. So it's possible that if that is the case, that you would have seen what they classify a werewolf.
Well, interesting to note, and even what I was saying before, as you mentioned with Jeff Natalone, that the stuff with MK, and that he had learned from a lot of different indigenous people, is that the possibility of multiple kinds of variances, sizes, shapes, all of that can happen as a result of, whatever it may be, crossbreeding. I think
Sure.
one of the interesting things in the cryptic environment, and here we are talking about that, is the research that was done about the supposed chupacabra that was found by the doctor down in the States, who had it stuffed. It was in a freezer for a while. She had a bunch of DNA research, and they realized the uncommonality of the animal was actually a derivative of the fact that I think it was a type of American wolf crossed with a Mexican type of coyote. And they didn't think on a breeding level it would work, survive, or whatever. But obviously, chance mutation, Darwinism, however you want to look at it, there's some faction of the way that that animal became what it is. And now that is now part of that special dimension. That animal bred with another animal, the chances of its traits could very well be there, again, creating those mutations.
Right.
MK had told me in the past that the Yakima, kidnapped women, and they not the Yakima did, but the Bigfoot, the Sasquatch, or these, so that they could have this new thing in their breeding population. I find it interesting from an anthropological level, as a sort of amateur anthropologist, that if you think about early hominids and what created certain strengths in certain species was the fact that they were crossbreeding. If you remember in the movie Quest for Fire, I always love this part of the film where, they got him in the village with the clay people, and they're examining him. This sort of Neanderthal guy, right? They're checking out his teeth and his gums and his hair and his stature. And the chief realizes, no, we want this guy here breeding with our women so we can bring this new trait into our culture because we think it's a good thing to have. And in the film, he ends up with these huge, robust women, doing all this stuff so that he brings his seed into the culture. And I think that's the same thing with a lot of cryptids, and even though as to where things can go with it, that the possibilities could be endless, even on a dimensional level that we're not totally capable of understanding.
Yeah, well, the thing that struck me about all this the most is the fact that our view of reality is so much narrower than the actual truth that seems to exist around us, right? And at this point, most of what we're coming up with all this stuff is just speculation and theory anyway, because we just don't have enough to go on at this point.
That's right.
However, I try to draw on all the sources I've heard and come to generalizations, loose generalizations based on that. But it's crazy. And like you pointed out as well, there's many different types of cryptids. People have seen canine or dogmen that look like that people describe as a jackal or a hyena, right? That for all intents and purposes looks like a hyena, but is also bipedal. We also have the stories of goatmen, satyrs, which is mentioned in the Bible 4 different times. And even in St. Jerome, who's the author of the Vulgate, which is the common source of the Bible we use today, he gave a biography where he talks about St. Anthony of the Desert, who was this monk that lived out by himself, in the wilderness. And he said that he claims he came upon a creature that was a half man, half goat, commonly referred to in the Bible as a satyr, and straight out of Greek mythology.
Wow. That's it. This is what's really interesting too, like you said about the cryptic environment and all the possibilities of what is out there. And you were mentioning the dogman and stuff. I've also even heard with the grassman in Ohio, which people have said is very gorilla-like, also has the potential to be very dog-like,
Right.
and looking more like canine as opposed to like humanoid or gorilla-like in some kind of a way. But
Right.
yeah, that it's fascinating because, again, I think being aware in the environment in a completely different way starts to show itself. Not every day. It's not meant to happen every day, and sometimes you could go a lifetime without ever experiencing something like that, even though you may be open to it. I think what's more interesting to notice is the sheer amount of events and things that have happened with all kinds of cryptids and phenomenon all through history. I think there's something to be said about what they represent on a cultural level. Even if you don't have that physical experience, it serves somewhere as part of cultural allegory, that maybe it's teaching us something more about ourselves than we really know without even having to see it. The idea that the natural environment is just as important, as opposed to separating yourself in some kind of a way and becoming robotic and clinically absorbed into the ether. That's one of the things for me personally in my own experience. Not like I wasn't a tree hugger before. I grew up on a farm, man. I love camping and canoeing and hiking. I did stuff like that all my life, but at the same time, this re-amplified that for me in a way that even permeates into my daily life. From the things that I touch with my hands to how I experience my craft and my art form, they're all somehow supplemented by these events. Even the spiritual events that I've had with loved ones that have passed on, or things that I can't explain, they're not something that are sitting there on my shoulder like the battery, I dare you to knock it off. They're in my back pocket as a reminder, and always tapping on my shoulder saying, who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing? What is your experience about? How are you feeling this experience? Are you enjoying this experience? There's so many things that blockade our day-to-day emotional thinking about it. We pump everything from our limbic system that you can think of into the platforms of today, but how much of it are we really experiencing?
Right.
And that's what for me is always re-amplified through this in some
Yeah.
way.
Going back to when you first saw the creature, what was your first emotional response? Run that through me again.
Fear.
Fear.
Well, yeah. Well, no. At first, it was bewilderment, because I questioned, why is there somebody, a man, a large man, tall man, wearing my skidoo suit is like snow blow with is blue, dark blue, navy. If you saw me at a distance, it would probably look black. I also wear balaclava. It's got a stripe in it, though. You can tell that it's a balaclava because the winds get bad here. This wasn't. It was all black body. So I'm like, what? It's hot. I'm wearing shorts and like a t-shirt, and it's hot out. Nobody in their right mind would be walking around in a skidoo suit and a balaclava pulled over their face in that kind of temperature. That was my first. I was bewildered. What am I looking at? And then the very next thing, I'm like, wait. And then the very next minute, I'm like, fear, processing. What is this? Okay, I'm trying to gather it. It's running on its four legs now. Do I run? That's fear. All that is fight or flight.
Right.
Then it's stopping, and then again back into the state of wonderment, which is, what is it going to do now? What am I still looking at? Where is it going? Will I see it again? Who am I going to tell? All of that is so it's bewilderment, fear, fight or flight, bewilderment. In three basic terms.
Do you think it was aware of your presence at any point?
I do. I think it became aware of my presence when I first came up, and I was standing there, and then as soon as I started to kind of like realize it was squatting down, that's when I genuflected. And when it squatted down, it wasn't until later that I started to think to myself, well, I'm upwind of it. It must have given way to a warning it that I was around there. Because even if it was a bear, I had given it enough time by the distance between my house and the rise in the hill to let it know that I'm walking and I'm stinky and I'm sweating and I'm a human and you're going to smell me.
And at that moment, what was your emotional response when you realized that you think it was aware of your presence? What did your intuition tell you at that point?
Run, turn, look, go, figure out the quickest route away from your position to a safe place at your house.
So flight.
Yeah, fight. There was nothing I could think of to do in that position to fight. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a stick, and nothing that I could formidably deal with what I was looking at, and the size of what I was looking at, and the sheer speed and inertia of the animal. The immediate thing was, I got to get out of here.
Right. And you also said that the processing of this and dealing with even the fear of this has stayed with you long after. Is that right?
Yeah. It's been years since. It's been 5 years really since it happened.
So you said this took place in 2015.
Yeah.
And so what's been your mental process, or how you've dealt with it since, and how it's affected you?
I kind of let the fear go after I started hearing stories like that. It's okay, that it wasn't going to do that. It wasn't going to hurt you. You weren't going to be, injured. That has somehow erased my fear and increased the intense interest that I have when it comes to trying to figure out more about that environment in all perspectives. It's heightened that awareness in me, but I, again, the fear of it. No, I've been to the bush tons of times since then, with and without my dog.
Did you have any nightmares?
Never about it. It was never a nightmare or another thought other than a waking state about what it could represent.
Right. And you said that you also heard other local kind of legends or rumors in your general area of similar sightings. Can you go into detail on that?
Yeah, the one that struck me the most was in 1992, and it was a group of 4 people in a vehicle that were coming. There's a small town south of me called Orangeville, and a lot of the side roads all bleed down in main arteries, just like everywhere else. And you can take whatever side road you want to get from A to B. So these people were coming from Orangeville up to my neck of the woods, going to wherever they were going. But the report that I remembered, and so I'm 2015 from mine, in 1992. So you're looking at 30 years almost span in between when all that kind of happens and occurs. That it was the similarity of them being made aware that when they were driving, that this, like, you drive, you're on a side road. You could be like tree line, ditch, open field, trees, little bit of space. There's ditches. There's no sidewalks. There's nothing like that when you're living out in the country. I'm like 2 hours north of any major metropolitan area. I'm the only person around here that has high speed up until a little while ago. There's nothing up here, right, other than windmills and farming. So what in their description was that they were worried they were going to hit something running. It was dusk. So their perception of the situation was it could be a deer. I've almost run into deer here on side roads, just going to a restaurant at night, in the early evening at certain times of the year, fall, the spring, doesn't matter when it is. There could be something that's going on, and so that's what they did. They slowed the vehicle down. And when they slowed the vehicle down, the report of them, 4 of them had reported what they thought was a jackrabbit sized a man that was the size of, jackrabbit that was the size of a man, all hairy and running just like I had described, with that back legs to forward legs, like you would see a jackrabbit doing what it's doing, or a greyhound or a dog. When in slow motion, you can watch the under part of the legs come under the underbelly of the animal, so it can grab the earth, push it forward, and get ready for the next step in its progression. So it was that was really interesting in terms of that's like what I remember. Like the first thought I had was this running and the way that it was running, and that it was weird. It was not normal for a human to be able to do that. Another report that I read that happened in 1922, which was just up the road, another 40 minutes from me. A lot of S turns here in roads because of little swamps and bogs and different things like that are up in this neck of the woods. People would just come around one of these little S turns in one of the roads, and their lights gave way to what they said was this large, hairy, walking like beast across the road that was 7.5 feet tall. That was, again, back in the 20s again. The other one that was from around the 30s from the time frame was people that were in a swimming hole that were kind of near forest, and while they were in the swimming hole and they were hanging out for the afternoon, they started hearing monkey sounds starting to come from the forest that was near the pond area, like simian like hooping and all this kind of crazy stuff. And they were very afraid, packed up whatever they were doing by the pond, and they left. A couple orchards, reports about farmers' orchards in this area where trees were completely destroyed. Not like just the apples, but the tree from bottom to top was picked completely clean. And I'm talking about a 14-foot tree, a 15-foot tree within an evening. That this happened on a regular basis, and they weren't sure what it was because it wasn't deer and it wasn't birds and it wasn't insects. That seemed to somehow correlate with a lot of these stories that where farmers were concerned. We haven't had anything that was mutilatedly related, but another farmer that was just about a kilometer and a half, mile or so up the road from where I am, almost kitty corner to like my farm property, heading to the northeast, had in the evening reported hearing this crazy, like what he said was a cross between somebody being killed and like a lion roaring in the middle of the night. He was woken up by it, went outside, and that was the report that he had given in terms of what I was looking at as far as this information. That had only happened just in 2010. So just only 5 years before whatever my experience was. And he's only like a mile away from where my property is. Then looking at maps and things like that, I also understand that all the little pock marks of forests that exist that, you know, you can move from forest to forest following a lot of the creek lines that are around here, seem to be also in this weirdest of ways where a lot of these kinds of things were happening. This farmer sighting, or not sighting, but hearing this kind of stuff in the middle of the night where I am, another pockmarked area, forest, highway on one side, off to the distance, side roads off to the other side, cemetery, nobody around. Same thing with the event that happened southwest of me in Orangeville, nobody around, side roads, 4 people witnessing it. It all seemed to be on this parallel line that almost stretched from the southwest to the northeast. So, and I looked at it and I go, well, that's all the little forest systems and everything. Of course, anything from a fox, a wolf, you know, I would take it if I, you know, like as I said before, if I was trying to elude people or anybody, that's where I would be.
Right. Yeah, so there's stories of other activity in that general area. Since
Definitely.
you had your encounter, do you feel safe in your home?
Yes.
Being out there so remote?
Yeah. That's what I was getting at. I guess it's like, yeah, I don't feel worried anymore because I don't feel a threat of it. I understand it now. It's not something I want to go looking for. And if it happened again, I'd welcome it because I understand more about what it may be. I never afraid in my home. I'm not afraid to go back to my bush now, walk the creek. I go back there with my metal detector. You know, I still occasionally look into the deeper part of the you know, did I hear something? What was that thud? You know, but it's not anything that'll make me pick up and leave.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. You should have, you know, the love for your home and the forest and nature and your gardening and all that kind of stuff shouldn't have to be, you know, ruined or run off by that. So I'm really glad to hear that.
Thanks, man.
We're coming close to the end, but I wanted to touch back on what you mentioned before about in your area. You had you said documented UFO sightings at Buttonville Airport.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, back in 1960, would have been 68. My mom was making dinner. We had an old farmhouse in the town of Markham, little hamlet called Victoria Square, and a 100-acre farm there, beef cattle. My dad, mom had started bringing beef cattle into the country from a different part of France called Blonde d'Aquitaine. Never here before, but anyway, the farm, as I mentioned, is part of my life, but part of a lot of family allegory comes from that experience of being there. So mom's making dinner. It's November, dusk, you know, comes early. Everything's, you know, dark by 4:30, 5 o'clock. And they're sitting around the kitchen table. And my mom thought that all the pipes started rattling in the windows in the house. And she thought maybe something was wrong with the sump pump in our basement. So she went down to the basement to check it out. As she coming back up the staircase gives way to a big bay window, which is where the kitchen table was. And like 8 of my family members are sitting there waiting for dinner. My mom ducks, jumps to the floor because she sees this bright light that she thinks is an airplane that's going to crash into the house. And because we were so close to this little airport, the Cessnas and stuff like that flying all the time, right? Even small Lear jets were flying in and out of that airport. she then realized as she looks up that the light is not moving, but it's really, really bright. And she tells my family, she says, look out the window. And everybody turns and looks. And the report from my family, grandparents, brothers, and sisters is this: the light was this oblong, egg like shaped ball with a grouping of lights around the third of it that were aquatic looking. Light that you couldn't define as one color because it was swirling into itself in a band. It was so bright that you couldn't look at it. It was hard to look at, like if you were looking at an arc light on a welder. If you turned away to look away from it because it was so bright, the realization from my family is it's casting no light. Like a incandescent light bulb would candesce a shadow from a telephone pole or a tree. There's no shadows being cast from this thing. They watch it for about 5 minutes. It's just sitting there hovering between our barn, and our family home, chicken coop in behind it. All of a sudden, my mom says it just lifted up very slowly, went over top of the barn, and she said it started following the geography of the land like a bouncing ball heading to the southeast. So my dad's in council. He comes home. My mom, grandparents, brothers and sisters tell him what happened. We don't believe you, or he doesn't believe them. You're full of you know what. Sure enough, my mom's got the newspaper out on the table the next morning from the local Richmond Hill and Markham newspapers. 6 different unidentified flying objects tracked in that neck of the woods that evening, plus the David Dunlop Observatory, which is a faction of the University of Toronto, had also released a report on tracking abnormal movement of unidentified flying objects.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
More and more, I find more and more governmental sources and pilots are coming to the forefront of being more open about the subject matter.
It's great because it brings a lot of validity. Even a friend of mine, I don't know if you know, former Minister, Chief of Defense here, Paul Hilliard, is good friends of my father because my father was in federal politics for a number of years. He's come out, right, and said, yes, we're in communication with different species of people, and they're interdimensional. We have some equipment. There's that this is not somebody that is,
right,
drinking next to an open fissure of methane and hallucinating. This is a reputable Minister of Defense saying, yes, this is a part of what's been going on and you should know nothing about it.
I actually listened to him say that live. Yeah.
The citizens hearing for disclosure that was really well put together. I think they did an excellent job. I wish he'd gone a little bit further and actually went to a national hearing. But yeah, the other thing that should happen is probably a Federal Reserve audit, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon either.
Exactly. Yeah, Japan also has always been, they've never tried to hide their UFO experiences. They've always been forthfront about it, and they say a lot about it as well.
Same thing with Spain and France, too.
Yeah, and you have NASA's already admitted that they found microbial life growing on the windows of the outside of the space shuttles.
Right. This is what I think has been interesting for me as a person in the last couple of years. I've become a devout studier of cosmology and the science of the cosmos, astrology, astronomy, mathematics, geology, that the potential for earth-changing events doesn't just happen through catastrophe. That having a helioscopic type of event, which means the heliosphere in the sun has the ability to strip comets of unbelievable cosmic material, everything from gases to biological material that can live, that can then actually make its way to the sphere and flourish depending on its environment and if it has the potential to do it.
Right.
Some of the most interesting moments of these events, if you look into the Peshtigo incident on the peninsula towards Michigan, that event basically was an ekpyrosis moment that some people speculate was related to the Taurid meteor stream, which happened almost identically around that same point in time, and it completely devastated and burnt that peninsula to the ground. Out of nowhere, the earth caught on fire, the air caught on fire. And here's an interesting thing about that is that there's a lot of precognitive moments with people where half of the village or the town itself was staved because of these events that happened before the event occurred. Illuminous beings coming to them, telling them that this would happen, practicing going in. Like right before the event happened, half of the town walked out into the water. And that half of the town that walked into the water didn't die from being engulfed in flames and burnt to the ground.
Wow.
It also coincides right around the same time as the Chicago fire, which ironically, again, happens around the time of the Taurid meteor stream, which means that these apocryphal moments that are coming from the cosmos are uncontrollable. And they also have the potential to even change DNA in terms of let's remove ourselves completely from Darwinism, talk about natural selection in a completely different way, or the idea that there's chance mutation. It's not just going to happen in a code because of something that happened in an incubative state from it being too cold or too warm. This could be cosmological in nature, and we have no control over it.
Right. Okay, well, we're going to wrap it up for today. On that note, I'd like to thank our guest, Ed Roman, and for everyone supporting the channel. We certainly appreciate it. And if anyone has any encounters they'd like to share, please contact us at support@dogmancams.com. That's all for today, folks. See you next time.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.